What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and I'm here to, kind of break down what is now a game that we've all had time to marinate on, in Tulane's 35-23 victory over the UAB Blazers, their first conference win on the season, and have a little time to get healthy and look at some things and come out of the bye week with a bang, looking at this Friday's game against Memphis on October the 13th, which is, usually spells bad luck, but I think that what you've seen for Tulane this year is you haven't necessarily seen them win by a lot of luck. A lot of times good football teams get by with a lot of opportunity, taking advantage of said opportunity, and a little bit of luck. I mean, you look at the Cotton Bowl, and I think that you see a little bit of all of that involved, particularly with Mario Williams fumbling out at the 1 yard line. Sometimes breaks go your way, and that's how the game goes. And it doesn't say anything about a team to me if that's how some games go. But as much as I think that the consensus reaction to this game was that they struggled more than they should have, they should have had, a more convincing victory. I mean, to me, 35-23 isn't exactly spell that close of a game. Yes, it was the first time that they've trailed going into the tunnel at halftime all season. And then the defense allowed 3 points out of half. I just think when you look at, again, the context of everything Tulane has already dealt with this season already, you just think again about all of the turnover going on the coaching staff and all of the key position roles. And I almost think that there was somewhat of an over focus, especially on defense, at some roles that I think were stronger than anticipated. And then other roles really just having a surprise in depth pieces that have been here all along. And just to not speak in weird riddles at this point, I'm talking kind of about the linebackers and the safeties, where I think a lot of the focus on defense was looking at, especially considering that there was turnover at the position group coaching as well, with the defensive coordinator and Shieldwood both being the new DC and linebackers coach, and then having to replace your 2 core leaders, your 2 leading tacklers, all that those guys brought. But you also had to replace the third level of the field right behind them, because if Tulane could do all they want to replace those linebackers, but if teams know that second level of the field route's probably going to get your running back wrapped up by a linebacker, you're going to have difficulty running the football. So let's just test their secondary. And I think you did see UAB test Tulane secondary a little bit, but I think the secondary has really been a quiet strong point more often than not. Every team is going to have breakdowns in coverage. I don't care what team you're a fan of. Most teams, especially when you're looking at new positions, looking at Saints fans here, which I think that there's enough crossover in this fan base that this is a reasonable thing that we can all kind of get with, where you look at a situation on defense where they had a shutout last week. So again, all of that to show you how much can go away in a week's time. But, the week prior in the loss to the Buccaneers, a lot of the focus came on the defense and how they didn't have the strongest game. And I just remember thinking, I don't think there's any reason to hit the panic button on a defense that, sorry, y'all, I thought the bye week would do better for my voice than it would, but allergies this year just do not seem to quit. But it's a lot more of a coughing fit than I anticipated for that brief pause. But just, again, thinking about context and looking at the Saints' defensive performance against the Buccaneers, they didn't have Paulson Adebo and they didn't have Marcus May. But what you're also not looking at in that situation is their starting slot cornerback, Alontae Taylor, is a new player at that role and has never played the position before, save for, a few snaps here and there in college. He's always been very much a true cornerback. And I personally thought that he really excelled there, but that with some growing pains that I think are oftentimes unavoidable at that slot on Tulane anchor role. And I've spoken again about watching that kind of Macon Clark grow into a slot corner right in front of my eyes, but seeing those early struggles, all that to say, when you're talking about a secondary like that, the fact that they have a player like Isaac Yadam who can come in and play for Paulson Adebo is a really good sign for me, more than overanalyzing one game where you're now having a new cornerback communicate with a slot corner that's still really getting into that role, and they're checking with a safety that is replacing Marcus May. And communication in the secondary is the most critical component. And so to have just the amount of defensive backs that we've seen Tulane have, there was actually a time during the game where I noticed that they were in dime defense. didn't necessarily work out on the play, but it was something that I liked seeing last year. It was worked in a couple of times as I just, this isn't really intention of running the play, but to me, it's a little bit of a flex. And yeah, we can trot 6 defensive backs out here and be credible about doing so. So I think the fact that you saw Tulane bring that personnel out at all with Tahira Noor and AJ Hampton rounding that group out. And again, as much as I'm talking about the context and talking about slot corner struggles, Cam Pettislow, again, was such a key pickup for Tulane. I just can't begin to emphasize it enough. But I think that Bailey Despaney and DJ Douglas should really get their flowers, including Darius Swanson too, because what stuck out to me the most and what was a really curious point for me was going to be both the coverage ability by those players, but how much Lemmy Young and Larry Brooks and Macon Clark were just terrors in the backfield stopping the run, how much Macon Clark blitzed and how good he was at it. And this year, you've just seen so many different players blitz. You've seen so much creativity, so many playmakers, really seeing all that depth pay off at all levels of the defense. Because again, talking about contests in the UAB game, Tyler Grubbs, who led the team in tackles against Ole Miss. He's a transfer linebacker that came in relief for Corey Platt, who led the team in tackles in week 1 and then proceeded to have, a blown Achilles. Well, he got a little banged up in the Nicholls State game. He was in and out. And the same thing happened in the UAB game. There was several stretches of time where he wasn't playing. Now, again, coming off of today's practice, health seems to be a lot better, which you would hope and expect after the bye week. And so I just think it was one of those situations of just needing to get to the bye. And I always think the timing of a bye week can oftentimes be the critical point in a team season. Because you get a bye week that's way too early. And this is a lot of the times in the NFL. Think about, again, the Saints, where one year they had a week 5 bye week. And so did week 6. But, in that same frame, the difference in college is that the regular season is 12 games and there's 18 games in the NFL. So a week 5 bye week. And the Saints got super banged up at the beginning of the year. I remember everyone thinking, oh, yay, Marcus Davenport will come off IR. We'll get CJ Gardner-Johnson's back. And I'm just sitting there thinking, they have so many weeks to go. You get these players back now, but now the foot's on the gas pedal and you don't have a week off until 18 weeks of this season go by. And at this point, I literally can't do the mental math of what week 5, 13. You have 13 more weeks to go. In college, we're essentially halfway there. And I think the team's health has been good outside of, your quarterback missing 2 matchups. But all things considered, I think that they went into the bye week with some guys that needed to have a week off. But again, all things considered, I think the way that they just continuously responded on the fly to all of these injuries and situations and next man up mentality. And, now Jared Small is in there stepping up in place of Tyler Grubbs. And who's led the team in tackles every week since the Ole Miss game? Jesus Machado, who is, again, one of those 2 linebackers that came in. And that's not even getting to the defensive line, the production by Devin Deal, who, to me, his 8 tackles, 4 tackles for loss and a sack are only pale in comparison to his mentality and how he responds in critical moments. Like when he had a really, I honestly haven't even gone back and bothered to look that much at that penalty that they gave him, but it's safe to say that it was definitely ticky-tacky at best. And it's one that I think the position of defense requires you to be more emotional in games, I believe, than the offense. And I just think there are a lot of players that would have gotten to them, and you just never see him make a peep. And that's now after he got ejected in the Southern Miss game for targeting. He was the first player to hold up the 4 fingers that they, you all see them hitting that at the start of the 4th quarter. I looked up and Devin Deal is ready to go with me, never complains at all, and has been a very quiet leader. And that's also something that Mackenzie Mitchell, again, she's been working with me here on this podcast and has been doing her thing on the sideline during games and observing, just again, based on her instincts. And, she's seen a lot of things in that avenue as well. I'm sorry, y'all. Part of the intention of me also taking a bye week alongside Tulane was to get my voice back, but alas, we're doing our best here. But I remember she said something to me during the Nicholls State game that Devin Deal was really standing out in terms of his leadership. And she said it again after, when we debriefed and I went over her notes for this UAB game. And, that's always something that I really enjoy is when guys that, again, are on the quieter side really step up. And again, especially considering that he was penalized, and that is kind of where the momentum got a little hairy, if at all, for Tulane. Objectively, they were not winning the game going into the tunnel at halftime. But I'll tell you, I am not going to pretend like my gut instinct has any correlation with whether or not Tulane wins or loses football games. But what I will say is both losses last year, I knew in about the second quarter in my gut that just based on, and I don't know how to explain it. People have asked me, what the most valuable thing I found or how I've been able to get into this industry without any experience and work on my analysis. And the more I think about it, it's honestly the fact that I think I have a really strong, keen gut instinct. I did spend time working in human behavior with my undergraduate degree in psychology, but I just think that it's something that you're either really tuned into or you ignore it more often than not. And that applies in real life situations, probably more than it does in football. But I've noticed my ability to act on my gut in real life, and more often than not, it has led me correctly in the times that I don't end up in a good place in life is because I've ignored said gut feeling. And it just, again, without giving away every single gut feeling I've ever had on the sideline at Tulane, I just feel like I have at least been able to pick up body language. I think that that's a really important thing. And it's funny as I talk about psychology because there are all these body language experts that sound so ridiculous, and it's not that deep. But when you can tell about a collective unit, about guys that usually don't check out, you can see that their body language is slumped. Fans picked up on the fact that Chris Olave for the Saints, and then he admitted to it, kind of mentally quit on the game halfway through. There are a lot of cues you can pick up by reading guys. And I joke about being this observant only child, but it's just kind of how I've been all my life. I've just made observations. I'm very comfortable in silence, just again, observing and just making mental notes of things that stick out to me or that, I think might be important. And again, I just kind of let it carry me in terms of what the momentum is. And there was actually a point during the game that I remember where Corey, in coming down to me on the sideline, I asked if it was after one of the two rushing touchdowns by UAB, if the sideline was dejected at all. And what I was watching in front of me was probably one of the most reassuring points of the season to me. And again, it took place off the field. I was over by the defensive back bench because there was just, even though it was a rushing touchdown, they drove down the field, and I don't remember why, but I was curious what that meeting was going to be. And with all of these absurd media timeouts now, I will say the only benefit I've gotten from that is I have a lot more time to go in and sit in on these meetings that otherwise wasn't there because that's, at the expense of me watching the game. But I go over there and there's a few players that are starting to sit down, and Lance Robinson and DJ Douglas come over and yell at them to, get their expletives up. And the entire defense really just gathered in this huddle with Lance Robinson really just preaching out in the middle. And the coaches were in this huddle as well. That's what stuck out to me the most, was the coaches saw that this was a moment that the players were having, and they backed off. There was no words uttered by the coaches during this entire meeting. Everyone went back and sat down. And it's just, again, I think it's really a testament to the trust that Sheil Wood has in these leaders on this team. But before I get off this tangent, Lance Robinson was really just saying, this is our conference and we don't fold. And it's not magic beans. It's not, oh, I figured out the secret formula to why they keep beating us on this route. But so much of the game of football to me, and more so at the college level than the NFL, is psychology and making sure that your head is in the game. And you could look at this game against UAB as a tale of two halves for Tulane, where I believe that Mekhi Hughes had 4 carries for 17 yards at halftime. Then they come out, they stubbornly ran the ball down UAB's throat until they were forced to respect it. And in turn, you finally got answers at running back 1. If you ask me, that is more valuable than a 30-point margin victory in terms of long-term goals for the season. Is it expected to be Mekhi Hughes? No, just to be upfront. He had there were guys ahead of him that had seen time in games. But I think, again, it really speaks to Willie Fritz and his ability to make these decisions and not make them based off of promises or things that aren't, relevant to the play that's on the field. And looking at these first couple of games, Mekhi Hughes definitely emerged. And that was the first time that a running back has had over 100 yards since Tajay Spears. Now, again, granted, we're 5 games into the next season, but when it's someone that, again, wasn't really expected and you didn't have this idea, and especially knowing that they were going to have this running back by committee for those first couple of games. And I think you've also seen a ton of promise from Arnold Barnes. Yes, he fumbled, and so did Shawty Clayton-Johnson. And that also, just to be honest, with all that Willie Fritz cares about ball security, it's an important thing. And there are 3 running backs, and Iverson Celestine also lost a fumble earlier this year. But Arnold Barnes is young, but he just has that physical electricity that you can't explain. But I think everyone that is a Tulane fan and has seen that kid run knows exactly what I'm talking about. So I think, again, now you really are starting to flesh out that room as your quarterback is coming back to full strength, because all of that probably would be solved a lot quicker if Michael Pratt was healthy. And, if I made XY decision, I might be living in Rome or doing this at this point. There's no sense in going back at this point, especially with injuries where, there are certainly, and I'm not talking about Tulane, but just in general, where you can look and see, like, how did that team allow this guy to go back in? A lot of the time with head injuries, more often than not, the NFL now has a spotter just specifically based for this. Again, players are their own worst enemies. But my dad, on the flip side, is someone that has been a marathon runner. He runs half marathons. He's over 70 years old. He's the most prestigious, disciplined trainer. And he does all of his warm-ups, all of his stretching. He has all the things I often don't do and just hit the ground running, and pulled his hamstring on one of his runs. And it was frustrating for him because it's hard to understand why those things just snap sometimes. All that to say, I let's just leave all of whatever involving that in the mirror and know that Michael Pratt is, again, on the rise. He broke passing touchdown, and like it or not, who 1-0 doesn't care how you got there at the end of the day. There are a lot of teams, including Tulane. When you look back at the 2-10 year, personally, there's no point in going back and rewatching that, and I just don't care to at this rate. But if you watched a lot of those games, they were in it a lot more than they weren't a lot of the time. The difference was couldn't close, and just ultimately it was either that they couldn't close or that the fourth quarter comeback was just a little too late. And as impressive as the onside kicks were, it just was too little too late. What you're seeing from Tulane this year is them workout struggles in real time that are unavoidable in college football, that they saw an astronomical level at, with, again, the level of turnover and leadership, but just literal bodies on the field. And then having almost all of them be coached by someone entirely new. I mean, that is just a lot easier said than done. And I think a lot of what you saw in the first half of this game, if I'm being honest, was one team just happening to be the beneficiary of neither of them, not knowing that much about UAB up until this point. I think the fact that they were able to adjust both offensively and defensively held them to 3 points again in the second half after heading into the locker room 20-14 trailing. And Mekhi Hughes ends the game with 123 yards after having 17 at the halftime mark. And again, there was just no sense that Tulane was out of the game. And even when they were going through the time where they were in a deficit, there was just a sneaky part of me that was saying, this, if they end up losing, then yeah, sure, this is not a good thing. But I, a lot of the time, think so much goes on during games that builds true grit and true character in teams. And what you saw in the Cotton Bowl last year cannot be described as anything other than that, is just built and lived grit, going through adversity and being unfazed when all of the chips are down. Again, to make the stops, to make the comeback when they did, and to have the mental fortitude to be in it at that point when so many teams would have checked out up to that point. The fact that you had Tajay Spears, who, went on into the NFL and had a career day that day on the field until they couldn't give him the ball anymore because of the fact that they had no timeouts. There is no question of players thinking about, okay, well, what, I'm going to the draft, so maybe I'll sit out. Again, it's just the mental fortitude is the most impressive quality to me by far in Tulane football. And I think that I can confidently say that that's the same trait 2 years now running, because to me, that win on 2 Saturdays ago, I'm doing fine. Full grit, and a grit in which you got answers at a really important position, and one in which, again, has definitely been hampered by the fact that your quarterback has been injured and or not in the game. And he is perhaps, the biggest weapon to unlocking that backfield in his damage that he could do with his legs on the ground. And just to point out how much Tulane really ran the ball in this game. I mean, Mekhi Hughes had 4 carries at halftime. I know Arnold Barnes had a few. I don't remember the exact numbers at halftime, but they ended the game with 41 total attempts by all of the, I was going to say running backs, but if you look at that stat sheet, it was something like 73 yards, if I'm correct, came from Yokeith Brown, Jaquan Jackson, and Lawrence Key, if I'm being correct. The motion, the jet sweep plays that you're seeing them really start to take off with Jaquan Jackson and Yokeith Brown. That's, again, something that they worked Lawrence Keys into the offense, into the fold. And he really was able to do that for them in games last year. I remember for some reason, it might've been Tulsa, where I just remember thinking, wow, it's really great that they have him for the ability to do those type of plays. They really use his speed back there. And again, to talk about the Saints and how unsurprising it is that they looked night and day when they began using motion, is it gives a little bit of a tell from the defense. When you're in coverage, you can usually disguise all you want, but you have to account for the person in motion. And whether you're in man coverage versus zone coverage versus pattern match coverage, which is, one that is kind of an amalgamation of both of them, but it's based on the routes that the receivers take downfield and just these rules around triangles. I haven't looked at that coverage in a really long time, so I'm not going to get totally over my head in discussing that. All that to say, if someone runs with them, you're able to see more of a man tell. If they stay put, if they adjust in some way, then you know that you're looking at a different type of coverage. And that allows you to dictate whether or not you're looking at cover 1 or cover 3, for example, where you have a single high safety in both of those situations, but you can see a little more zone in cover 3. People usually run cover 1 as pretty, man heavy. All that to say, that's, again, what people have been complaining about on the Saints and why motion helps an offense, because that also helps your offensive line. It helps your running back room. It just, any tells that you can award a team that, again, has little to no film on the team coached by Trent Dilfer and all these new coordinators up to this point. You ultimately still have film on a lot of returnees from Tulane system, and coaches largely are their philosophies. So again, we all have an idea of what Willie Fritz's is, and we've seen how he's been able to adapt to that based on, a weekly situation where they only had 28 carries in I believe it was the Nichols game, kind of concerning in a way when you're trying to kind of figure that out. And 9 of those were non-designed runs and were scrambles by Michael Pratt. But in this game, you saw them just run the ball down UAB's throats until, damn it, a running back emerged from that. And that was really where the game started to definitely change. And all of these philosophies, not only do you, in a usual situation with the head coach, have to wonder if they're going to bring their philosophies over or adapt the ones that are there. Trent Dilfer doesn't have one. No offense. I mean, he literally coached high school football, and I'm not trying to knock him, because I think you've seen that it can be done. Everyone has to start somewhere, and there's no template for how one must go about it. And, he's led the team to a Super Bowl, so he at least knows what it takes to win at the highest level. And watching them play USF, I think USF is going to be a little bit a potential sleeper this year, but they definitely are able to put out more than I think the perception of them was in the first couple games of the year. And so I think, again, when you look at the context of them leading 20-14 at half, hopefully this just kind of, again, grounds everyone and puts it back in perspective of the fact that Tulane is looking at 4 games in which I don't remember their exact opponents, but you can only take so much away from a few of those games. And ultimately, this is the first game in conference play. And it doesn't really matter how many players are there from last year when you have new head coaches and new coordinators and a head coach that has never had a football team of this level before, where again, you just can't plug in whatever was going on last year because those people are no longer there. And so that oftentimes is like, what I just was interesting to me growing up when I would kind of just learn these small things in football where, I always heard people talk about halftime adjustments and, I got it, I guess, but really like working on the sideline just goes to show me. And again, talking with Willie Fritz, hearing how he describes teams the Tuesday before games. And, again, in discussing with the fact that there's only so much that you can do, whereas they could go off of a lot more film on Tulane. The difference was Tulane took what it got in the first half, and that's your real-time game film. Their ability to adjust on both sides of the football should be more important than any other takeaway from this game, honestly, because that's also something that I think was a little bit of a struggle. And again, context, chicken or the egg thing here. I think Kai Horton, again, has done an incredible job considering the times that he's just been thrown into the fire and it being, the most dramatic time of the season whenever that was the case. But there's been times where the offense has had, a little bit of difficulties adjusting out of halftime. Well, it wasn't an offense that was necessarily designed for Kai Horton. And, seeing that the team was struggling a little bit in the last couple of games with respect to the offensive line, it's certainly one to note, especially after Nicholls State. It is an FCS school. I get it, but I will say that was probably the most surprising thing to me was how much size they had in the trenches. But again, contextually speaking, Tulane has had some injury struggles at guard the last couple of weeks. They had Prince Pines missing this game at left guard, and so Shadre Hurst was filling in for him. There's been a few times during the last couple of games where, he's come in for him for extended periods of time. Then you also saw Josh Remicich go down at some point during that game. And if I'm correct, I believe it was in the second half, but it just really stuck out to me. Now the offensive line that we talked about having only one change from last year in Cameron Wire at that left tackle role in the midst of one game, we've seen now, 3 new players from what we were seeing last year. And when your center has to play with changing of the guards in the middle of a game, Sincere Hainsworth was someone, again, in the tunnel where it stuck out to me that he sounded like Nick Anderson in the way that he was reminding his team that they only have 12 guaranteed opportunities. That's it. And playing better starts with himself. And, again, I think all of those offensive line players could probably admit it wasn't their best game, but it is difficult when you don't know the opponent's tendencies really whatsoever. And again, you're losing your interior protection mid-game and having to sub guys in that, yes, the fact that, again, Tulane continued to perform well in the second half, I think should be a testament to that. And Josh Remicich did end up going back in relatively quickly after he went out. So that's something. And again, he's been all good, but you have an injured quarterback who has injured guards, and UAB, I remember this from the 21 year thinking, dang, those guys have size. Unignorable to me that they are one of those schools in Alabama that, and I think you're starting to see Tulane reap those benefits in Louisiana where these guys that, Willie had said to us that, he used to have to fight against Nicholls State to recruit guys to come here. Now they're getting guys that are turning down Power 5 offers to come to Tulane, and a lot of homegrown talent, both in the recruiting classes that have been signed and the transfer portal. Just Tyler Grubbs, Dante Fleming, Lawrence Key. It's literally innumerable to me how many of these transfers have come back and are from this area and want to be around Louisiana. And the fact that to me is what builds you trenches. And if Tulane is starting to have strength on their defensive line in the trenches, just have to kind of go back and see where everyone's from at this point. But that's what I saw in UAB in that 21 year. And however they played in that game, I saw the same thing. And really what they have going for them was their size in the trenches. So I think Tulane, again, they learned how to battle real in-game adversity. And last year, things are almost going a little too well. Again, we always say that, and we're just ultimately people invested in a team. And I'm a cynical person in general, and I know Tulane fans have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and people in New Orleans are so traumatized by football at this point. I really don't blame them. But one more second. I was going to keep this short to conserve my voice, and then I've just kind of gotten on a tangent because I've missed talking about Tulane football. And now that I had my coughing fit, I'm trying to kind of remember where I was going with that point, but I think I'm just going to wrap this up now and say that, again, take away what you want from that game. What I'm going to take away from it is Tulane battled in-game adversity. They responded to it in real time. They found answers at probably, the most important question mark left at this point. And you see it again, the defense respond to a lot of different situations, a lot of different styles of quarterback. I think that was the best quarterback they faced. Jacob Zeno, to me, he's such a good operator. And the plays, I know the first series is always designed, but if you look back again, the plays were a little better than I would have expected kind of going into that game. I thought that they used decoys well. They put running backs out in space to run routes, and then would have kind of a wide receiver block over. It was just you could tell that there was thought going on there. And again, that's something that I guess you would expect to be a strength of Trent Dilfer's. But I think a strength of Tulane's is it's never going to be flashy scheme. It's never going to be some quick fix. It is staying true to their philosophy, playing their brand of football, which is winning the time of possession, winning the penalty battle, winning the turnover margin, and winning the rushing attack, and grit and balls by your head coach. Because, oh my God, I thought that I would never see anything crazier than the 4th and 1 call against Kansas State. And I was already up in the press box at that point. There was something in me. Again, I'm going to talk about my instinct one last time as I'm wrapping this up, where I didn't act on it. Something told me that I should take out my camera and record the 4th down play for Tulane. And I don't know why, because in my head, I'm thinking, I don't know what's going on here. This is a 4th and 9. There is something like, the 35. This is a 5-point game right now, if I'm remembering correctly. And, this is wild. And then all of a sudden the play's going, and I think everyone in collective real time, my dad included, which again, I want to just thank my producer, Dave Grubb, for giving me some time off to not only rest my voice, but spend some time with my dad, who was in town. And as someone that came to one game with me in the Superdome, it was really fun to see his experience of Tulane football be entirely changed in just one game by the experience of Yeoman Stadium. But in talking with him after the game, he was like, I could not believe what I was seeing unfold. And then what sticks out to me the most is it reminded me of Sean Payton in a way, where if there was a player that kept screwing up in the game, or, right after Drew Brees would throw an interception or something, they would immediately have that guy go out there, run a play, and just get it over with and get the yips out of the way. And I don't think it was anything that was alarming, but it was noticeable that someone that I had spoken with in Lawrence Keys, who said, and it was palpable, that he sat down with Michael Pratt after the Cotton Bowl and they watched film and really, clicked and got on the same page. That, I think there is something to be said about rust. And also, again, it's not the same thing as a broken back, but I remember when I talked about Jameis Winston and how much his entire throwing motion was affected by his broken back. I've just been paying so much attention to Michael Pratt's footwork. And I think that he has honestly played better than expected with regards to setting his feet with playing with that type of brace. But it just, to me, everything, you have to get used to playing with it. And so I can see again why that was the case, but they had kind of been off that game. There was an interception, I believe, thrown earlier on that year that it's kind of been that similar route. And there were several incompletions thrown in that game and almost interceptions. And it just felt like something was off with the two of them. And to me, the fact that on 4th and 9 with the game on the line, Willie Fritz says, yeah, Michael, go full send at this point. And the play calling by Slade Nagel, again, to give everyone due credit here, but again, to go to the connection that was hurting all game on 4th and 9 is wild when you think about it. But that's why I'm sitting here and I'm trying to, like I said, I got off track and lost my train of thought, having a coughing fit because I was planning on keeping this one short. But just, as I'm talking about it more and more, I hope that what I can offer on the sideline and attending practice daily and just really trying to keep the last 3 seasons in my working memory, take just more of these positives away from this game and just see really how important that call was. Because I go back to the Kansas State game and I think about the fact that, yes, Tyjae Spears didn't have the ball in that situation, but he was out there on the field and Michael Pratt momentarily bumbled the snap. He picked it up, but if not for Tyjae shoving him from behind, he got 2 yards out of that. And it would have been a question if he had converted that down situation. And that was when Tyjae, he'll be the first to say that he had a slow start to last year. He wasn't playing his best football. And he had like a very minuscule amount of yards in that entire game. The game after that was the first game that Tyjae was the leading rusher and leading receiver for the team, followed by the next week where he was also the leading rusher and the leading receiver for the team. And I'm not saying it all goes back down to him being out there on the 4th down play call, but I just will continue to point out these situations where even if it's not deliberate and even if it's just kind of an incidental psychological benefit of Willie Fritz trusting these guys and making these calls to allow them to work these things out in critical game moments, that's what builds teams. That's what builds championships. And that's, with all the talk about rankings and, if you want Tulane to get back to a New Year's Six bowl, then those are the kind of things that need to be done at this point, especially against a credible opponent, one that it was a solid 4 quarters of football. And you saw the good, the bad, the ugly, and ultimately a convincing win with answers again at a key position. And I think there's just a lot of Tulane teams in the past and a lot of teams in the league right now that these are the types of games that they go in and lose. And Tulane had to fight for this win. And I think it's going to carry them well into this game against Memphis. But I'm really looking forward to Friday Night Football. I think a lot is on the line here. And, not again to look that forward into New Year's Sixes and the likes, but with the way that the AAC teams have been performing this year, and Memphis has just been a team that, they erased a 17-0 deficit to come back and beat Boise State. Last year, Tulane was up something like 35-0 at halftime. Everyone left. And in Jarius Monroe's first game action, because that was a game Jaden Kennedy got hurt last year, he seals the game on a interception in the end zone in a game that got way closer than it should have, or that 35-0 deficit would have indicated. And then I just remember again, the performance of a lifetime by Tyjae Spears, becoming the 4th single, rusher in Tulane history, to have the highest output in a single game. There's so many verbiages involved in that at this point. That historic night in Memphis, and it was a very close loss, if I remember that correctly as well. But there are some conference teams that, you just always are going to have fits when you're playing them. I think that's the team for Tulane, but I also think that really lights a fire under them. I could think again, Tulane has done nothing other than give overwhelming evidence that next man up, responding to adversity and taking challenges as opportunities. They're right there in spades with all 3 of those categories. So that's all for me on this ramble of Before the Whistle, where again, I think just having the time to sit and marinate on that game, going back and watching it, but then just really, again, thinking about how many benefits and positives that came out, but really having to think about the context of, again, going all the way back to the 2-10 season in order for me to really see the value in that victory. So I will see you guys with my guest episode. Otherwise, off to Memphis. And I'm looking forward to getting back on the plane. It's our first, we traveled to Southern Miss, but this is our real first away game. And it feels like it's time for that. And I'm just grateful to be in this position where I'm talking about a team that is 4-1 and going in to defend their conference title under the Friday Night Lights. Just again, I just have to stop and continue to be grateful for what I'm able to do, and for just to, again, put in perspective how successful and fine things are, all things considered, going on at Tulane, including in their search for their next athletic director. All I will say about that situation is today was one of the most focused that I've seen the team in recent weeks. And for you guys, that's all you really need to know about that for right now. So I will see y'all next episode of Before the Whistle.